Hey there, you've just found incredible medicine. Hit like and subscribe to discover stories you won't believe.
Doctor, am I going to live? Those were the first words that trembled out of his mouth as he lay in the hospital bed, his thin chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His voice was cracked, as if the smoke that had filled his lungs for decades was still trying to choke him even there, under the sterile lights of the hospital. For a moment, the room fell into silence. The doctor, standing at the edge of the bed, lowered his eyes before answering, and in that pause the weight of a lifetime of choices seemed to crush the man's fragile body. Dear viewers, welcome, and I wish you a heartfelt good viewing of this powerful and unforgettable story. He had smoked his entire life. It started innocently enough, like it did for so many of his generation. He was just a boy of 14, hanging out with older friends who passed him a cigarette as if it were nothing more than a rite of passage. The first drag made his throat burn and his eyes water, but when they laughed and clapped him on the back, he smiled and forced himself to keep going. That was the beginning of a habit that would chain itself to him for more than 40 years. At first, it was just 1 or 2 cigarettes behind the school, then later after work, a way to relax, a way to fit in. He never realized how quickly his body was learning to crave it, how every cell was growing accustomed to the smoke that would soon become part of his very identity. By his 20s, he could no longer imagine a day without cigarettes. By his 30s, his fingers were stained yellow, his teeth carried the smell of ash, and his mornings began with violent coughing fits that he shrugged off as just a smoker's cough. His wife had begged him to quit. She had pressed her hand against his chest at night when he coughed so hard that it seemed like he might stop breathing altogether. His children had pleaded with him too, complaining that they hated the smell that clung to his clothes and the curtains of the house. He had promised them, once, that he would stop. But the truth was, every time he tried, he felt an emptiness, a gnawing need inside his chest that he could not silence. The cigarette became not just a habit, but a companion he could not abandon. Years passed, and the little signs became louder. Shortness of breath when climbing stairs, chest tightness when he laughed too hard, a constant dry throat that never seemed to heal. Still, he told himself he was fine. People lived with worse. He convinced himself that he was strong, that his body was different, that he could take the damage. He dismissed every warning, every campaign, every doctor's advice as exaggeration meant to scare people. But then came the moment when denial was no longer possible. It began with a persistent sore spot inside his mouth, a strange pain he felt when eating. At first he ignored it, rinsing with salt water, brushing harder. But the sore never went away. Instead, it deepened, and soon even talking became painful. He noticed blood on his toothbrush, a metallic taste that lingered after every meal. When his voice turned hoarse and he struggled to swallow, his wife forced him to go to the hospital. The doctor who examined him that day never forgot the look on his face. As he shone a small flashlight into the man's mouth, he froze. Behind the worn teeth and blackened gums, there was something far worse, lesions spreading across the lining of his mouth, a darkened mass that told its own grim story. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, and one stepped outside to call for a specialist. In that instant, the man's years of smoking were laid bare in a single terrifying image. He sat in stunned silence as the diagnosis was explained. The cigarettes he had clung to for comfort had been silently building their revenge inside him. His body was no longer just tired, it was broken. The cancer had spread, and the chances of reversing it were slim. When the words finally sank in, his face went pale. He remembered every warning he had ignored, every time he had waved off his children's complaints, every cough that he had dismissed as nothing. They all returned to him now, cruel and unforgiving, like ghosts whispering what he already knew. The hospital days that followed were long and heavy. He was surrounded by machines, wires running across his body, for drips feeding him strength that his body could no longer provide. His family visited, their eyes red with worry, their voices trembling as they tried to offer hope. He reached for their hands, his once steady grip now weak, almost childlike. And in the quiet moments, When he was alone, he stared at the ceiling and thought about the life he had bought with smoke, and the price he was paying now. The story of this man was not just a medical case. It was the story of millions who believed they could outrun the truth, who convinced themselves that the warnings were for someone else. His journey was raw, painful, and deeply human. It was a reminder that every choice leaves a mark, even the ones that seem harmless in the moment. Doctor, am I going to live? That question hung in the air, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever gambled their health against time. And as his story unfolded, it became clear that sometimes the answer was written long before the question was ever asked. The doctor placed his hand gently on the man's arm, not with the confidence of someone who could give reassuring answers, but with the quiet heaviness of truth. He didn't speak right away. The silence was louder than any words. The man searched his eyes desperately, but all he found was sorrow. His family sat nearby, his wife clutching a folded tissue so tightly that her knuckles turned white. His daughter leaned forward in her chair, biting her lip to keep from crying, and his son sat rigid, fists clenched on his knees, anger and fear battling inside him. That hospital room became a mirror of his entire life. The walls smelled of antiseptic, the monitors beeped at steady intervals, and the fluorescent lights hummed above, all reminding him that his time was now measured in seconds, in breaths, in weak heartbeats. He could not stop replaying memories in his mind: the first time he lit a cigarette as a boy, the laughter of his friends as they teased him into proving he was a man, the years of late-night smoke breaks at work when he thought he was calming his nerves. He thought of the evenings he could have spent walking with his children, the mornings he could have greeted with clear lungs instead of a rattling cough. The doctor finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "We will do everything we can, but you need to understand how advanced this is." The man swallowed hard, though every movement burned. Advanced? That word lingered in his chest heavier than the smoke ever had. It was not just an illness anymore, it was the full price of decades of choices. His wife broke into sobs, covering her mouth with trembling hands. His daughter's tears fell silently onto her lap, and his son leaned forward, whispering, "Dad, why didn't you stop? Why didn't you listen?" The words cut deeper than any diagnosis. The man tried to answer, but the truth was, he didn't know. The addiction had been stronger than love, stronger than reason, stronger even than his own fear of death. The days that followed were filled with endless tests, blood samples, scans that revealed shadows no one wanted to see. Each time the doctors returned with results, the news grew heavier. There were options: chemotherapy, surgeries, aggressive treatments, but none came with the promise of a cure. At best, they could give him more time, fragile and painful time, a borrowed extension of a life already scarred by smoke. Every night in the hospital, when his family went home to rest, he lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the muffled sounds of other patients down the hall. Coughs, cries, machines beeping in rhythm with fragile lives. In that silence, he thought of how differently things could have been. He imagined himself at family dinners without the constant urge to step outside for a smoke, imagined walking his daughter down the aisle without being short of breath, imagined playing with his grandchildren instead of scaring them with the smell of tobacco and the sound of his hacking cough. One evening, a nurse came in to check his vitals. She was young, maybe the age his daughter had been when she begged him to quit. She smiled softly, adjusting his foredrip, and said, "You remind me of my uncle. He smoked too. He didn't make it this far." Her words weren't cruel. They were a simple truth, spoken with the tired honesty of someone who had seen too many endings like his. The man looked at her and whispered, "I thought I had time." She didn't reply. She just gave his hand a squeeze and walked away. His body weakened each day. The mirror no longer showed the man he had once been. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale, his hands trembling as he tried to hold the water cup. And yet, in those quiet, fragile moments, he felt something he hadn't in years: clarity. He saw how one choice had repeated itself thousands of times until it became the story of his life. He realized that his children, his wife, his friends, they all carried the weight of his addiction too. It wasn't just his lungs that were filled with smoke. It was his family's years of fear, frustration, and helplessness. And so, lying there under the hospital lights, he whispered again, this time not to the doctor, but to his family. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked, but his words were clear. His wife held his hand against her cheek, tears streaming down. His son bowed his head, fighting his own emotions. His daughter pressed her forehead against his arm, whispering back, "We just wanted more time with you." The machines beeped on, steady and relentless, a cruel reminder that time was slipping through his fingers like ash. And yet, for the first time in decades, there were no cigarettes in his hand, no smoke in his lungs, no lies to himself. There was only the truth, raw and undeniable. The next morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the hospital blinds, painting pale stripes across his bed. The man blinked against the light, his body drained but his mind restless. His wife had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on folded arms, the tissues still clutched in her hand. Seeing her like that filled him with a sorrow deeper than any pain. She had carried the burden of his choices for years. The worry, the arguments, the smell of smoke that clung to every curtain and pillow in their house. He wanted to reach out, to smooth her hair and tell her that he wished he had listened, but his arm trembled too much to move. Doctors came in with calm efficiency, checking charts, adjusting machines, writing notes in silence. Their faces gave nothing away, but he could read the weight in their eyes. He had seen it before in the way they paused before speaking, in the sighs they thought he couldn't hear. Every glance was another reminder that he was not just sick, he was slipping further away each day. Later, his children arrived. His daughter carried a photo album, one that had been tucked away in the family home for years. She sat by his side and opened it carefully, showing him the pictures, his wedding day when his smile was bright and his skin full of life, his children as babies, sitting on his lap, family holidays at the seaside, his shirt open, a cigarette dangling from his fingers even then. Every page seemed to hold a ghost of smoke curling in the background. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear. He stared at the photos, his eyes welling with tears he had not let fall in decades. His son, who had always been more distant, finally spoke. His voice was tight, controlled, but the anger inside still burned. "Do you know how many times I begged you to stop? Do you remember the smell when you came to my school events, how I prayed my friends wouldn't notice? Do you realize how many nights I lay awake as a kid, wondering if you'd cough yourself to death while we were sleeping?" The room grew silent. His son's words cut through the air, sharp and unrelenting. The man wanted to defend himself, to explain, but there was no excuse that would erase the truth. He lowered his eyes, ashamed, whispering only, "I know." The tension broke when his wife reached over and took both of their hands, pressing them together over the blanket. "He's here now," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Let's not waste what little we have left." Her words hung in the air, binding them together in fragile peace. As the hours passed, the man's mind wandered through memories he had buried long ago. He thought of his first job at the factory, where every break meant a cigarette with the other men, laughter and smoke mixing in the air. He remembered the long car rides with the window cracked open, the smoke trailing behind as his children coughed in the back seat. He remembered the arguments with his wife, her tears as she begged him to stop, the promises he had made and broken again and again. Each memory was a reminder of how he had chosen the cigarette over everything else, his health, his family, even his dignity. That night, a specialist came to speak with them. The options were few. Surgery was possible but dangerous. Chemotherapy could be attempted, but it would weaken him further. Radiation might slow the spread, but it would not reverse the damage. None of it promised healing. The doctor explained everything in clinical detail, but all the man heard was the echo of his own question, "Doctor, am I going to live?" The room fell quiet after the doctor left. His wife turned to him with red-rimmed eyes. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. He stared at her, at the lines on her face that years of worry had carved, and he realized that the decision was no longer just his. Whatever time he had left belonged to them too. He looked at his children, at the pain and love mixed together in their eyes. I don't want to die hooked up to machines, he whispered. But I don't want to give up either. If there's a chance to fight, even a small one, I have to take it. Not for me, but for you. His voice cracked at the last word. His daughter held his hand tightly, nodding with tears streaming down her cheeks. His son turned away, wiping his eyes quickly, not wanting to show his father how deeply those words had cut. And his wife leaned closer, whispering, "Then we fight. Together." That night, as the machines hummed around him, the man closed his eyes and tried to imagine a life without smoke. A life he had never given himself the chance to live. He thought of what it might feel like to breathe deeply without coughing, to hug his children without the smell of tobacco on his clothes, to kiss his wife without the taste of ash between them. It was a life he had thrown away, but for the first time, he allowed himself to dream of it. The next day began with the quiet shuffle of nurses moving from bed to bed, their shoes whispering against the polished floor of the ward. The man was awake before they entered, staring at the ceiling as the early light filtered through the blinds. His chest rose and fell with effort, each breath sounding like a battle. He turned his head to see his wife still by his side, her hand resting on the edge of the bed as if she had been guarding him through the night. When the doctors arrived for their morning round, the air in the room grew heavy again. They discussed treatment plans in clipped, professional tones, but beneath their words lay a current of doubt. "We'll begin with tests to see if his body can handle the strain," one said, flipping through the file. The man listened, nodding faintly, but inside he felt a wave of regret crashing harder with every syllable. How strange, he thought, that the cigarettes he had once held so casually in his fingers now held his life in theirs. Later, his daughter returned with fresh flowers, their fragrance filling the room with a sweetness that felt foreign compared to the bitter smell of antiseptic. She placed them by his bed and smiled, though her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "When you taught me how to ride a bike?" Her voice wavered, and before he could answer, she added, "You ran beside me, cheering, even though you were out of breath. I thought it was because you were tired from running. I didn't know even then you couldn't breathe properly anymore." Her words hit him like a knife. Memories of that day flooded back, her small figure wobbling on the bike, his hand steadying the seat, the cigarette waiting for him in his pocket the whole time. He forced a weak smile. "I remember," he whispered. "You were so brave." She squeezed his hand, but her tears fell silently, sliding down her cheeks one by one. His son stayed quieter, pacing the room like a caged animal. Anger still burned in his eyes, but beneath it was fear, raw and unspoken. Eventually, he stopped by the window, staring out at the gray sky. "I don't want to lose you," he muttered, his back still turned. The man's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything to fix the years of distance, but all he managed was, "I don't want to leave." The simplicity of the words carried the weight of everything left unsaid. As evening approached, a nurse wheeled in a machine to prepare for his upcoming procedure. The man watched in silence, his reflection flickering in the stainless steel surface. He hardly recognized himself anymore, the gaunt cheeks, the hollow eyes, the shaking hands. He thought of the boy he once was, laughing with friends, a cigarette between his lips like a badge of courage. If only that boy had seen this reflection waiting at the end of the road. That night, unable to sleep, he whispered to his wife, "I wasted so much time." She reached for his hand and shook her head firmly. "You gave us love, even if you lost your way. That's what I hold on to. That's what our children will remember too." Her voice was strong, though her eyes shone with tears. But he knew the truth. Cigarettes had stolen years he could never return. They had stolen his health, his laughter, his peace. And yet, in that hospital bed, he realized they had not stolen everything. He still had his family, still had their love, still had this chance, however fragile, to fight. The machines hummed, the night deepened, and he closed his eyes, clutching his wife's hand as if it was the only anchor keeping him from drifting away. The following morning came with the sound of rolling carts and the low murmur of doctors conferring in the hallway. The man's eyes opened slowly, his body heavy as if weighed down by years of smoke that still clung to his lungs. He turned his head and saw his wife already awake, her face pale with exhaustion, yet her hand never leaving his. She had aged alongside his addiction, carrying the weight he had refused to acknowledge. The doctors entered with their charts, their voices steady, rehearsed. They spoke of tests, biopsies, and the possibility of beginning treatment within days. Each word sounded clinical, detached, but the man caught the hesitation in their tone. He could see it in their eyes, the quiet doubt, the knowledge that medicine could only do so much when years of damage had already been written into his body. When they left, his son approached the bed. He had been pacing again, unable to sit still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at his father with an expression caught between anger and grief. "Do you even realize what you've done to yourself? To us?" His voice was sharp, cracking under the weight of emotion. The man's throat ached, but he forced out the truth. "I do now." His son turned away, but not before the man noticed the tears he tried so hard to hide. His daughter placed the photo album back on his lap. This time, she opened to a picture of him holding her as a baby, her tiny hands reaching for his face. "I don't remember this," she whispered, "but I wish I did. I wish I had more memories of you without the smell of smoke." Her voice broke, and she quickly closed the album, unable to go further. The man's heart ached in ways no diagnosis could measure. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry, that he would give anything to change those years, but the words felt too small against the enormity of his mistakes. The day dragged on with tests and procedures. Nurses adjusted his forearm, drew blood, and moved him from one sterile room to another. Each time, he caught glimpses of other patients, hollow-eyed men, frail women, all bearing the same marks of choices that had cost them their health. For the first time, he realized he was not alone in this suffering. The hospital was filled with stories like his, lives shaped by decisions they could never undo. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, painting the windows in gold, his wife leaned closer. "Do you remember our first vacation together?" she asked quietly. He closed his eyes and pictured it, the sea, the warm air, her laughter carried on the wind. He remembered the cigarette dangling from his fingers even then, the haze of smoke mixing with the salty breeze. "I ruined it," he whispered. She shook her head. "No. You gave me memories. Even through the smoke I saw you. That's what I hold on to." Her words pierced through the fog of guilt that wrapped around him. For years, he had believed he was alone in his choices, that only he bore the consequences. But now he understood. His family had carried his addiction too, every cough, every night of worry, every moment shadowed by smoke. That night, he lay awake again, the machines beeping steadily beside him. He thought about the countless cigarettes, the years spent chasing the illusion of relief. And he wondered, with every shallow breath, if this hospital bed was the only ending possible for a life lived in smoke. The hospital ward grew quieter as night deepened, but his mind refused to rest. The dim glow of the monitor screens painted faint shadows on the walls, and every beep of the machines reminded him that his body was now dependent on wires and tubes to keep going. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing back through time, retracing a lifetime of moments he could never reclaim. He remembered his father's hands, rough, callous from years of factory work, and the first time he saw him light a cigarette. He had been just a boy, watching with fascination as the smoke curled into the air. Back then, it seemed like a sign of strength, of adulthood, something powerful. He had never imagined that the same smoke would one day trap him, leaving him helpless in a hospital bed, asking doctors if he was going to live. His wife stirred in the chair beside him, half awake, adjusting the blanket on her shoulders. He turned his head slightly, watching her. The years had lined her face with worry, but her presence never wavered. Even now, exhausted and fragile, she stayed, holding vigil beside him as though her presence alone could keep him alive. He whispered her name, his voice hoarse, and she opened her eyes. "I'm here," she said softly, reaching for his hand. The weight of everything unsaid pressed down on him. "I never thought it would end like this." he murmured. She squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. I begged you so many times, she whispered. Not for me, for you. I wanted to grow old with you, not watch you fade like this. Her words broke him in ways the diagnosis never had. Tears slid down his cheeks, and for once, he didn't try to hide them. The next morning, the doctors prepared him for another series of scans. The machines buzzed and clicked, capturing images of the damage that years of smoke had etched into his body. He lay still, the cold surface beneath him, the bright lights glaring down. He could hear the faint murmur of the technicians on the other side of the glass, their voices low, their expressions unreadable. When they wheeled him back into his room, he felt smaller, diminished, as though each test stripped away another layer of hope. His daughter was waiting with a notebook in her hands. She had begun writing letters to him, small fragments of memories, pieces of her life she wanted him to know before it was too late. She read one aloud, her voice trembling. Dear Dad, when I was little, I used to sit outside your door, waiting for you to finish smoking so I could hug you. I hated the smell, but I loved you more. I thought if I waited long enough, maybe the smoke would be gone, and I could just have you. The words pierced him like a blade. He covered his face with his hands, sobbing quietly, ashamed of how blind he had been. His son stood near the window, silent, his jaw tight. For hours he said nothing. Finally, when the room fell quiet, he spoke. I was angry at you for so long. But now, I'm just scared. I don't know how to live without you, even if you weren't always really here. The confession cracked his voice, and he turned away, hiding his tears. The man reached out weakly, his hand trembling in the air. His son hesitated, then crossed the room and grasped it firmly, the anger between them dissolving into grief. That evening, the family sat together in the small hospital room, the hum of machines surrounding them. No one spoke much. Words felt too fragile, too small to hold the weight of what was happening. Instead, they sat in silence, holding hands, breathing in rhythm with the man's labored breaths, as if somehow their unity could carry him forward. The man closed his eyes, drifting in and out of sleep, and in those fleeting moments of clarity, he thought of how different everything might have been if he had quit when his children begged him to, when his wife cried at night, when his body first began to fail. But he hadn't. And now every breath was both a gift and a punishment. The machines continued their steady song, and the night stretched on, endless and heavy, carrying the weight of his choices. The following day began with the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway and the rattle of breakfast trays being rolled past his door. The man stirred awake, his chest aching as if every breath carried the burden of his past. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the soft fragrance of the flowers his daughter had left by the window. He turned his head toward them, watching the petals tremble in the draft from the air conditioner. Fragile yet still alive, a contrast that made his own frailty even sharper. The doctors entered soon after, their voices low but deliberate. They spoke of his test results, their language wrapped in clinical terms he barely understood, but the look in their eyes told the story without words. The damage was extensive. His lungs bore scars of years inhaling poison, his mouth carried lesions that spread with frightening speed, and his body, thin and drained, struggled to fight back. The man listened quietly, nodding, though inside he felt hollow. Each word from the doctors was not just information, it was a verdict, a reminder of what he had done to himself. When the doctors left, his wife leaned over, brushing his hair back from his forehead. You're still here, she whispered. That's what matters. But he saw the fear hidden behind her fragile smile. She had spent years fearing this day, and now it had arrived. He wished he could take her hand and promise her a future free of smoke, of coughs, of worry, but promises came too late. His daughter sat by the bed again, the notebook open on her lap. I wrote another one, she said softly. Her voice trembled as she read. Dad, I used to hold my breath when you smoked in the car, counting the seconds until I could roll down the window. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to be angry. I just wanted you to know that I tried to protect myself, even when you couldn't protect me. She closed the notebook quickly, her tears spilling over. The man reached for her hand, his fingers trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I didn't know. I didn't know." His son stood in the corner, arms crossed, staring at the floor. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you regret it?" The man turned toward him, his face pale and drawn. "Every day," he admitted. The honesty hung in the air, raw and heavy. His son nodded once, his lips pressed tightly together, and for the first time, he moved closer, resting a hand on his father's shoulder. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. As the hours passed, the hospital sounds became part of the rhythm of his day: the steady beep of monitors, the occasional cry of another patient down the hall, the murmur of nurses exchanging shift reports. Each sound reminded him that he was part of a larger story, one of countless people who had walked the same path of denial and regret. In the quiet of the evening, he thought about the cigarettes he had smoked. Thousands upon thousands, each one a small act that seemed harmless in the moment but had built into this. He imagined them stacked in front of him, a mountain of ash and filters, taller than him, heavier than his body could ever carry. It wasn't just smoke. It was years, choices, and pieces of his life burned away, one puff at a time. His wife read to him that night, her voice steady even as her eyes blurred with tears. She chose an old book they had once shared in their younger days, her words weaving through the hospital room, soft and soothing. He closed his eyes, listening, and for a moment he was transported back to their living room, decades ago, when the children were small and life felt endless. The sound of her voice was a balm, a reminder that love had endured even when he had failed to care for himself. When the lights dimmed and the hospital settled into its uneasy silence, the man whispered again into the darkness, "Doctor, am I going to live?" But this time, he wasn't asking the doctors. He was asking the silence itself, asking the years he had lost, asking the family he feared to leave behind. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the machines kept time with his fading strength. The following day began with the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway and the rattle of breakfast trays being rolled past his door. The man stirred awake, his chest aching as if every breath carried the burden of his past. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the soft fragrance of the flowers his daughter had left by the window. He turned his head toward them, watching the petals tremble in the draft from the air conditioner. Fragile, yet still alive, a contrast that made his own frailty even sharper. The doctors entered soon after, their voices low but deliberate. They spoke of his test results, their language wrapped in clinical terms he barely understood, but the look in their eyes told the story without words. The damage was extensive. His lungs bore scars of years inhaling poison, his mouth carried lesions that spread with frightening speed, and his body, thin and drained, struggled to fight back. The man listened quietly, nodding, though inside he felt hollow. Each word from the doctors was not just information, it was a verdict, a reminder of what he had done to himself. When the doctors left, his wife leaned over, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You're still here," she whispered. "That's what matters." But he saw the fear hidden behind her fragile smile. She had spent years fearing this day, and now it had arrived. He wished he could take her hand and promise her a future free of smoke, of coughs, of worry, but promises came too late. His daughter sat by the bed again, the notebook open on her lap. "I wrote another one," she said softly. Her voice trembled as she read. "Dad, I used to hold my breath when you smoked in the car, counting the seconds until I could roll down the window. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to be angry. I just wanted you to know that I tried to protect myself, even when you couldn't protect me." She closed the notebook quickly, her tears spilling over. The man reached for her hand, his fingers trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I didn't know. I didn't know." His son stood in the corner, arms crossed, staring at the floor. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you regret it?" The man turned toward him, his face pale and drawn. "Every day," he admitted. The honesty hung in the air, raw and heavy. His son nodded once, his lips pressed tightly together, and for the first time, he moved closer, resting a hand on his father's shoulder. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. As the hours passed, the hospital sounds became part of the rhythm of his day: the steady beep of monitors, the occasional cry of another patient down the hall, the murmur of nurses exchanging shift reports. Each sound reminded him that he was part of a larger story, one of countless people who had walked the same path of denial and regret. In the quiet of the evening, he thought about the cigarettes he had smoked. Thousands upon thousands, each one a small act that seemed harmless in the moment, but had built into this. He imagined them stacked in front of him, a mountain of ash and filters, taller than him, heavier than his body could ever carry. It wasn't just smoke, it was years, choices, and pieces of his life burned away, one puff at a time. His wife read to him that night, her voice steady even as her eyes blurred with tears. She chose an old book they had once shared in their younger days, her words weaving through the hospital room, soft and soothing. He closed his eyes, listening, and for a moment he was transported back to their living room, decades ago, when the children were small and life felt endless. The sound of her voice was a balm, a reminder that love had endured even when he had failed to care for himself. When the lights dimmed and the hospital settled into its uneasy silence, the man whispered again into the darkness, "Doctor, am I going to live?" But this time, he wasn't asking the doctors. He was asking the silence itself, asking the years he had lost, asking the family he feared to leave behind. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the machines kept time with his fading strength. The night passed slowly, with every hour dragging like an eternity. The man drifted in and out of sleep, jolted awake by coughing fits that left him gasping for air, his chest heaving as if it were fighting against him. Each time, his wife would rise from the chair, holding a cup of water to his lips, whispering soothing words that he could barely process through the haze of exhaustion. She had become his anchor, her presence keeping him from slipping too far into despair. In the early morning, the hospital staff changed shifts. The new nurse who entered the room was kind-eyed, gentle in her movements as she checked his vitals. She spoke to him softly, almost like a daughter would, asking if he needed anything, adjusting his pillows, smoothing the blanket. He watched her carefully, noting the way she carried herself, the patience in her voice. He wondered if she had ever pleaded with someone in her family to quit smoking, or if she had already seen too many men like him, bound to their bed by choices made decades earlier. Later that morning, a specialist arrived to review his condition. The conversation was direct, honest, and difficult. "We can attempt surgery," the doctor explained, "but the risks are high. Your body is weak, and recovery would be uncertain. Chemotherapy may slow the spread, but it will exhaust you. None of these are cures, they are battles for more time." The man nodded slowly, the words sinking into him like stones. Time. That was all that remained. After the doctor left, his son finally broke the silence. "Why did you never stop?" he asked, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. The man closed his eyes, gathering the strength to answer. "Because I thought I couldn't," he admitted. "Because I lied to myself. Every time I promised to quit, the cigarette whispered louder. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. It controlled me." His son looked at him for a long moment, then turned away, pressing a hand against his face as tears filled his eyes. His daughter, sitting by the bed with her notebook, began to write again. After a moment, she read aloud. "Dad, I forgive you. I forgive you because I see now that addiction is stronger than pride. I forgive you because, even with your flaws, you were still my father. I just wish you had forgiven yourself sooner." Her words broke something inside him, and tears streamed down his cheeks. He reached for her hand, clutching it with what little strength remained. The day wore on with tests and procedures, each one leaving him weaker. The nurses came and went, adjusting wires, changing 4 bags, recording numbers that seemed meaningless to him. He no longer cared about the charts, or the medical jargon. All that mattered now was the presence of his family, the warmth of their hands, the sound of their voices. As evening fell, his wife leaned closer, brushing her lips against his forehead. "You're not alone," she whispered. No matter what happens, we're with you. Her words wrapped around him like a blanket, giving him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and imagine what life might have been if he had listened, if he had quit, if he had chosen differently. He saw himself running with his children without gasping for air, laughing with his wife without the smell of tobacco between them, watching his grandchildren grow without the shadow of illness hanging over him. But when he opened his eyes, he was back in the hospital bed, the machines beeping, the tubes connected, his family watching him with fragile hope. Reality pressed down on him, but he held their gaze, knowing that even in his weakness, his love for them remained stronger than the smoke that had consumed his life. The night crept in again, and as the room fell silent, the man whispered one more time, "Doctor, am I going to live?" The question floated in the darkness, unanswered, lingering in the quiet rhythm of the machines. The corridor outside his room echoed with the squeak of wheels and the murmur of hurried conversations, but inside, everything felt suspended, as though time had slowed down to match the fragile rhythm of his breathing. The man lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hiss of oxygen flowing through the tubes. Each breath was shallow, dragging as though drawn from the bottom of a deep well. When the nurse came in to change his four, she greeted him with a gentle smile, trying to mask the concern in her eyes. He had begun to notice the way people looked at him now, with pity, with sadness, sometimes with a kind of resignation that hurt more than the illness itself. She checked the monitors, wrote something down, and then gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before leaving him alone again. His wife moved closer, smoothing the blanket over his thin body. Her touch lingered on his chest, where his heart thudded unevenly. "Do you remember our anniversary in the little cottage by the lake?" she asked softly, her voice almost breaking. He closed his eyes, the memory flashing before him, the water glistening in the morning light, her laughter echoing across the shore, and even then, the cigarette in his hand. He nodded faintly, his lips trembling. "I ruined so much with these hands," he whispered, looking at the fingers that had held thousands of cigarettes, the same fingers that had once held hers with strength. Their daughter came in shortly after, her eyes swollen from crying but her smile forced for his sake. She sat by his bed, opening the notebook again. "I wrote something new last night," she said. Her voice shook as she began. "Dad, I know you're afraid. We all are. But I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I just want you to fight, not for the years you lost, but for the ones we still have. Even if they are short, I want them with you." Her words pierced through the fog of guilt clouding his mind. He gripped her hand, tears spilling freely down his face, unable to speak but praying she understood. His son entered quietly, slower than usual, his posture heavy. For the first time, he pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. He didn't speak right away, just stared at his father's gaunt face, his sunken eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "When I was a kid, I used to think you were invincible. No one could scare you. You always stood tall. But then the coughing started, and it never stopped. I hated those cigarettes because they stole my hero. I wanted my dad, not the smoke." The man turned his head toward his son, his lips trembling. "I wanted to be your hero," he whispered, his voice breaking. His son's eyes filled with tears as he reached over, placing his hand firmly on his father's arm. "You still are. Even like this. Don't give up on us now." The words lit something faint inside him, a spark buried under the ashes of regret. For years he had convinced himself it was too late, that his family had given up on him. But here they were, holding on to him with a love that had survived every disappointment, every broken promise, every cough-filled night. That evening, the doctors returned to discuss the plan. The decision was brutal: surgery to remove what they could, though it carried enormous risk, or palliative care that would ease his suffering but surrender the fight. The family gathered around as the options were laid out, the room thick with silence after the doctor left. His wife looked at him, her hand trembling in his. "It's your choice," she whispered. He swallowed hard, the weight of their eyes pressing on him. For the first time in his life, he realized that his choices had never been his alone. Every cigarette he had smoked had been shared with them, in their fears, their tears, their lost moments. Now, this choice belonged to them as much as to him. The night grew darker, the machines humming in their endless rhythm. His family stayed close, their hands on his, their presence wrapping him in warmth. He closed his eyes, hearing their quiet breathing around him, and for the first time in years, the smoke was gone. All that remained was love, fragile, desperate, and unyielding. The following morning, when the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, the man stirred awake to find his wife still by his side. She hadn't moved much through the night, her body curled uncomfortably in the hospital chair, her hands still clasping his as though she feared letting go would mean losing him. He studied her face, the exhaustion etched into every line, and a wave of guilt washed over him. For decades she had begged him to stop, and now, she was the one paying the price for all his refusals, sitting day after day in this sterile room, waiting for news that never seemed to bring hope. The doctors entered soon after, carrying with them the heavy air of decisions that could not be postponed. They explained again, slowly, that the cancer had spread aggressively. The surgery was possible but dangerous. The chances of survival were slim. "It is not about curing," one of them said carefully. "It is about giving you time." The man nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He felt the words settle deep inside him, heavy like stones. When the doctors left, his daughter moved closer, clutching her notebook as if it were a lifeline. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she forced her voice steady. "I dreamed last night that you came home," she said. "Not to the house we have now, but the one we grew up in. You were sitting in the kitchen, no smoke, no coughing, just drinking tea and laughing with Mom. It felt so real." Her words pierced his heart, a cruel reminder of the life he could have chosen. He reached for her hand, whispering, "I wish I had given you that, Father. I wish I had given you that memory." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "You're still my father. Even now." His son, usually guarded, finally allowed his anger to dissolve into vulnerability. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice raw. "I hated the cigarettes more than I hated you. But I couldn't separate the two. Every time you lit one, I felt like you were choosing it over us. Do you know what that did to me?" The man's throat tightened. "I know," he rasped. "And if I could take it back, I would. Every single one." His son wiped at his eyes quickly, nodding once. "Then don't give up now. At least fight. For us." The room grew still, the weight of their emotions pressing in. His wife finally spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "We've lost enough to those cigarettes. If there's a chance, no matter how small, we have to try. I don't care how hard it is. I don't care how much it hurts. I just want you here." Her words settled over him like a blanket, not comforting, but binding, pulling him back to the reality that he was not alone in this battle. As the day wore on, preparations for treatment began. Nurses moved briskly in and out of the room, adjusting machines, preparing medications, speaking in low voices. The man watched them, feeling both fear and resignation. His body was frail, his strength nearly gone, but inside him flickered something he hadn't felt in years, the faintest spark of determination. That night, as the hospital settled into silence, he lay awake listening to the breathing of his family beside him. His wife in the chair, his daughter curled up with her notebook resting on her lap. His son leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. They were here because of him, because they loved him, even after everything. He closed his eyes, feeling their presence, and whispered into the darkness, "I'll fight. For them." The machines beeped softly, steady like a heartbeat, as the night stretched on. Outside, the city moved on without him, but in that small hospital room, time seemed to stand still, holding them together against the weight of his past. The next morning arrived with the faint sound of church bells drifting in through the hospital window. The man opened his eyes slowly, the pale sunlight cutting across the room, illuminating the faces of his family still gathered around him. His wife was awake, her eyes red from sleeplessness, yet her grip on his hand was steady. His daughter sat near the window, writing again in her notebook, pausing every so often to look at him with a fragile smile. His son stood with his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though grounding himself against the storm of emotions that had consumed them all. The nurse entered quietly, her steps soft, carrying a tray of medications. She adjusted his fore and checked the monitors, then glanced at him with a look that seemed to say more than words could. "You'll be moved later today," she explained. "The team is preparing for your treatment." Her voice was calm, but he could feel the tension hidden beneath her professionalism. Every step forward carried risk. When she left, the silence in the room thickened until his wife broke it. "Do you remember?" she asked gently. "The summer at the cabin by the river? You promised me you'd quit then. You even threw the pack into the water. For a few weeks, I thought maybe you'd finally done it." He closed his eyes, the memory sharp and painful. He remembered the laughter of his children as they splashed in the water, the warmth of the sun on his skin, and the crushing weight of craving that had followed him even in that perfect place. "I failed you," he whispered. She shook her head quickly. "You failed yourself? But you never stopped loving us. That's why we're here now." His daughter put her notebook aside and leaned closer. "I've been writing these letters," she said softly. "Not just for you, but for me. Because I want to remember the good, not just the smoke. I want to remember your voice when you told me stories at night, your smile when you watched me perform at school, the way you always made me feel safe. That's my father, not the cigarettes." Her words shattered him. Tears welled in his eyes, rolling down his hollow cheeks. "I don't deserve that," he whispered. She shook her head firmly. "You do. Because despite everything, you're still here. And you're still mine." His son finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Do you know what I remember?" he said, not lifting his eyes. "Standing outside in the cold, waiting for you to finish a cigarette before we could leave. Sitting in the back seat, rolling down the window just enough to breathe. Lying awake at night, listening to your cough and wondering if it would stop." His words cut through the air like a blade, but then he lifted his head, his eyes shining. "And still, you're my dad? I hated what you did, but I never stopped needing you. That's why I can't let you give up now." The man looked at his son, the anger and love so tightly wound together in his face, and felt the crushing weight of regret. Yet within that pain was something else, the realization that it wasn't too late to give them what he had always denied them, the effort to fight, however small the chances. That evening, as preparations for his first treatment began, the room filled with quiet activity. Nurses moved swiftly, explaining procedures, preparing machines. His wife held his hand, his daughter read softly from her notebook, and his son stood close, silent but present. The man felt fear coursing through him, fear sharper than anything he had ever known. But this time, he was not alone. As night fell, he whispered into the darkness, not to the doctors, not even to himself, but to the family who surrounded him. "I'll try. I'll fight. Not for me. For you." The machines beeped on, steady and unyielding, carrying him into the unknown of the next day. The hum of the machines blended with the muffled sounds of footsteps in the corridor as the night deepened. The man lay awake, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling above him, his thoughts tangled in memories and fear. His wife's hand still rested on his, her touch light but steady, anchoring him in a world that seemed to be slipping further away with every passing hour. He turned his head slightly and saw his daughter asleep in the chair, her notebook resting on her lap, pages filled with the words she hadn't yet read to him. His son sat slumped against the wall, his head tilted back, his chest rising and falling with uneasy breaths. For the first time in years, they were all together, not scattered by arguments or silence, but bound by a fragile thread of love and desperation. When dawn finally broke, the nurses came in to prepare him for the next stage. Their movements were brisk and professional, but beneath the routine he sensed their quiet compassion. One of them, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, adjusted his fore and whispered, "You're stronger than you think." He tried to smile, but his lips barely moved. Inside, he wondered if strength was really still in him, or if it had long since burned away with the smoke that had filled his lungs for decades. Later, the doctor entered with a folder of results. He spoke in careful, measured tones, explaining what lay ahead. The treatments would be grueling, the side effects severe. There would be pain, weakness, and moments when he would want to give up. But there was also a chance, slim, fragile, but real, that he could hold on longer. The man listened silently, his wife gripping his hand tighter, his children watching with wide, fearful eyes. When the doctor finished, the room fell into silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. Finally, the man nodded slowly. "Do it," he whispered. "I can't promise I'll win, but I'll fight." His wife leaned closer, tears shining in her eyes. That's all we needed to hear. His daughter reached for his other hand, holding it tightly as if she could transfer her strength into him. His son exhaled heavily, his face tight with emotion, and for the first time in years he said, "I'm proud of you." Those words broke something open inside the man, and tears spilled freely, not of regret this time, but of a fragile, trembling hope. The hours passed slowly as preparations continued. Nurses adjusted machines, explained procedures, and set up equipment. The man lay still, his mind wandering through the years. He thought of the first cigarette he had ever smoked, the way he had coughed and laughed, thinking he was invincible. He thought of the thousands that had followed, each one a step further down the path that led him here. And he thought of the faces of his wife and children, the love that had survived despite everything, and he wondered if perhaps that love could carry him through what lay ahead. As evening fell, the room grew quiet again. His wife read softly from the old book she had brought, her voice weaving through the silence like a lullaby. His daughter scribbled in her notebook, pausing to glance at him with a faint smile. His son sat closer now, his arms no longer folded, his gaze steady on his father. Surrounded by them, the man felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he wasn't reaching for a cigarette to fill the silence. He was reaching for their hands, their presence, their love. The machines beeped steadily, their rhythm a reminder of both fragility and endurance. The man closed his eyes, whispering into the dim light, "Doctor, am I going to live?" The question no longer carried despair, but something else, a plea not just for himself, but for the family who held him in their hearts. The night was long, and sleep came only in fragments. Each time his eyes closed, he drifted into restless dreams, visions of smoke curling around him, of laughter mixed with coughing, of his children calling for him while he stood outside with a cigarette burning down between his fingers. He would jolt awake, gasping, only to find the hospital room around him, the steady hum of machines grounding him in reality. His wife's hand remained clasped in his, her grip unyielding even in her sleep. She had always been the one to hold him steady, even when he was too stubborn to see it. By morning, the staff arrived to wheel him into another ward for treatment preparation. The corridor seemed endless as the bed rolled forward, the sterile white walls lined with doors that held stories like his, patients clinging to time, families holding on to hope. He caught glimpses of other faces as he passed, hollow-eyed men, women clutching at rosaries, children sitting quietly beside their parents' beds. It struck him that every one of them carried their own regret, their own silent battles. In the treatment room, bright lights flooded his vision. Nurses moved efficiently, attaching tubes, adjusting monitors, explaining the process. He barely absorbed their words. His mind was elsewhere, on his wife's weary face, on his daughter's trembling voice, on his son's unspoken forgiveness. He felt vulnerable in a way he never had before, stripped of the illusion of strength he had once clung to. Hours later, back in his room, his family gathered again. His daughter brought out the notebook, flipping to a new page. Her voice shook as she read, "Dad, I used to think cigarettes were more important to you than us. But sitting here, I see that you're fighting now, even when it hurts. That's the father I always wanted, the one who doesn't give up." Her words sank into him like medicine, healing a wound deeper than the disease itself. He reached for her hand, his eyes wet. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he whispered. She bent forward, resting her forehead against his arm, and for a moment, there were no cigarettes, no sickness, just a father and daughter holding on to each other. His son sat nearby, silent but present. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "When I was a teenager, I used to hide your cigarettes. I thought if I made them disappear, maybe you'd stop. You always found another pack, and I thought I had failed. But now I see, I wasn't failing. I was just trying to save you." His voice cracked, and he looked away. The man's heart ached at the memory of those hidden packs, the frustration he had felt, the harsh words he had spoken. "You didn't fail me," he rasped. "I failed you." His son turned back, eyes glistening, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not anymore. You're trying now. That's what matters." The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. His wife leaned closer, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering. "We can't undo the past," she said. "But we can face what's ahead together. No more lies, no more smoke, no more running. Just us. Whatever time we have left, it will be ours." The man nodded weakly, overwhelmed by their love. For so long, he had believed he was alone in his struggle, chained by his addiction, bound to his regrets. But now, lying in that hospital bed, he realized something he had never truly understood: they had never left him. Even when he pushed them away, even when he chose the cigarette over their pleas, they had stayed. And now, when he had nothing left to give, they were giving him everything. As night fell again, he whispered into the quiet, "Doctor, am I going to live?" But this time, the words were not just a question. They were a promise to fight, a vow whispered into the darkness, carried by the hands that still held his own. The final days in the hospital unfolded slowly, each one measured by the steady rhythm of the machines and the fragile breaths he struggled to take. The treatments had begun, but they drained him, leaving his body weaker, his skin pale, his voice reduced to a whisper. Yet through it all, his family never left his side. His wife remained his constant shadow, her hand always in his, her eyes carrying a strength that seemed impossible after so many sleepless nights. His daughter continued to write, filling her notebook with words she knew he might never fully hear, but she read them anyway, her voice trembling with love and sorrow. His son grew quieter, his anger melting into something softer, an understanding, even a kind of forgiveness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the room filled with the golden glow of twilight, he turned to his family with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. His breathing was shallow, his body frail, but his mind was sharp, his heart overflowing. "I spent my whole life thinking I had more time," he whispered. "I thought one more cigarette wouldn't matter. I thought I could quit tomorrow or the day after. But tomorrow never came. And now, here I am." His wife pressed her forehead against his hand, her tears wetting his skin. His daughter sobbed quietly, clutching her notebook. His son leaned closer, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his father's face. "I can't change the years I lost," he continued, his voice cracking. "But I can tell you this: I love you. More than the smoke, more than my pride, more than anything. I should have shown it better. I should have fought harder. I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, raw and final, a confession decades in the making. The room fell silent, but the silence was not empty. His wife kissed his hand, whispering, "We always knew. Even through the smoke we knew." His daughter laid her notebook on the bed, whispering, "I'll carry your words with me." His son gripped his arm tightly, saying, "You're still my father. And that's enough." As night settled in, his breaths grew slower, each one a fragile thread holding him to the world he had fought so hard to stay in. His eyes fluttered open one last time, and he whispered the question that had haunted him from the beginning. "Doctor, am I going to live?" But this time, he wasn't asking for himself. He was asking for them, for the family who would carry on after him, for the memories they would hold, for the lessons his life had carved into their hearts. The doctor, standing quietly at the foot of the bed, bowed his head. "You've already lived," he said softly. "And you've given them what matters most." Moments later, the steady beeping slowed, then stopped. The room was filled with silence, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of love, of a family bound together not by smoke and regret, but by forgiveness and memory. His wife pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering through her tears, "Rest now. You're free." His daughter closed the notebook, holding it to her chest. His son stood tall, his eyes wet but his expression firm, carrying the weight of his father's last fight. And in that small hospital room, filled with sorrow and love in equal measure, his story came to its end. Not as the tale of a man consumed by cigarettes, but as the story of a husband, a father, and a man who, in his final moments, finally understood the true cost of his choices, and the unbreakable power of his family's love.